In this video, we will try to understand these are some of the concepts which we'll see in our video now. Like first, we'll start with BGP neighborship. Like majorly, we have two types of neighborship in BGP. We got internal BGP and external BGP. So we'll see the differences, and also we'll try to see the basic configuration of the BGP routing protocol. We'll just try to understand the basic commands in this video. Probably in our next video, we'll try to get into our labs. Okay, so we'll try to understand some basic commands, and then finally we'll move to the different types of BGP tables. Like OSPF maintains 3 tables, EHRP maintains 3 tables. Similar way, BGP also maintains these 3 tables. So we'll try to differentiate what are those tables. That's what we'll see. So let's get started with BGP neighborship. So BGP neighbors are similar to your OSPF neighborship or EHRP neighborship, but there are some few differences or few things which are not similar. Like the BGP neighbors form the neighborship by using a TCP connection. So on port number 179, and then they will exchange the routing updates. The BGP updates are only exchanged once they form the neighborship, and then this neighborship has to be manually configured. Now this neighborship is manually configured. We'll see that commands. So what's the meaning of manually configured means? I'll try to get into that. Okay, so let me tell you what is this manual neighborship. Now BGP neighborship is also called as BGP peers, or we also call it as BGP speakers. Now mainly there are two types of neighborship: IBGP neighborship, internal BGP, and external BGP. And one more point, the neighborship has to be manually configured. Now what is exactly manually? So in this manually configuration, like if I take an example, in case of OSPF or EHRP, let's say I'm using EHRP or OSPF protocols, even these protocols also maintains a neighbor table where automatically whenever you advertise this interface, it's going to send a hello message on a multicast address, and when you advertise the other interface, it is going to reply to that hello message, and then they will automatically build a neighborship, and they automatically become neighbors of each other, and they build a table called neighbor table. And we can verify with show IP EHRP neighbors in case of EHRP, and we can use show IP OSPF neighbors. Now there is something manual automatic neighborship, or even in those protocols we can configure manual neighborship. So that is again secondary thing. But in case of BGP, these two routers only exchange the routes after forming the neighborship, just like OSPF. But the difference is, on the router 1, we have to configure a command called neighbor, and whatever the IP address, let's say 191.1.1.2, and then on the router 2 you have to configure another command saying that neighbor whatever the IP, let's say 1.1.1.1. So when you manually configure on both the ends, and if both the ends the configurations are correct, and if both the ends these neighbors are reachable, then only they will form the neighborship. Now the major difference between your IGP neighborship, that is EHRP OSPF, in EHRP OSPF, the neighborship happens automatically based on multicast address, whereas in case of BGP, neighborship has to be manually configured. That is the one major difference. So we'll see the configuration as well as we move on with our trainings here. It's also called as BGP peers or BGP speakers, and we got two types of neighbors. We got internal BGP neighbors and external BGP neighbors. So the basic difference again between these two is, internal BGP neighbors we call as IBGP neighbors if the routers, this router A, router B, this is router A, router B, router C, router D, all these 4 routers are neighbors of each other, and all the 4 routers are in the same AS. What is that AS? Autonomous System 65500. Now these all routers are referred as IBGP neighbors because router A is a neighbor of router B, router B is a neighbor of router A, and both belong to the same autonomous system number. Now this type of neighborship we call as internal BGP neighbors, whereas here you can see C and X, these two are external BGP neighbors. We call them as EBGP neighbors because router C is in AS 65500 and router X is in autonomous system 65100. So they both in different AS. We call them as external BGP neighbors. Like I got a diagram here, you can see C and X are EBGP neighbors and D and Y are EBGP neighbors, whereas all the A, B, C, D or internal BGP neighbors. So that's a basic difference. And then the next thing we'll see, just like your OSPF or EHRP, BGP also maintains three kinds of tables: neighbor table, BGP table, routing table. Now when you talk about routing table, it's a similar one. It contains a list of best routes. Whatever the best route installed in the routing table, it will be shown by using a command called show IP route. Neighborship neighborship table contains a list of neighbors which are configured by the administrator. And one more thing we discussed just now, the neighbors has to be manually configured by using a neighbor command. And for verification, we can use show IP BGP summary and show IP BGP neighbors command. These two commands will be very useful to verify whether the neighborship is up or not. Okay, now one more thing is, now this neighborship no need to be directly connected. So we'll see that split horizon rule, those things will definitely get into when we get into labs. We'll see in our next video probably. And then BGP table, it contains all the routes which are advertised in BGP. Known by BGP nothing but all the networks whichever you advertise in BGP, we can verify by using a command called show IP BGP command. So majorly this BGP table we'll see more in detail when we move on with probably after 4-5 videos we'll be getting into this BGP table verification. But the next 3-4 videos will be majorly focusing on neighborship, how to configure the neighborship and what are the different ways of configuring the neighborship. Okay, because if the neighborship is up, then everything you can see the things will work only once the neighborship is established. Okay, we have a lot of variations in the neighborship, like internal BGP neighbors, external BGP neighbors, neighborship using loopbacks, and neighborship using route reflectors, so neighborship using peer groups. We have a lot of things. So probably we'll try to get into those things more in detail in our next 4-5 videos. After that, we'll be focusing on this BGP path selection process. So when we discuss BGP path selection process, we'll be focusing here. So that is something we'll be getting into more in detail later on. And then verifying the routing table, also the same thing. And the last thing before we finish this video is we are going to see the basic configuration. Now the basic configuration in BGP is similar to your EHRP or OSPF. Like we start with router BGP and then we have to define the autonomous system number, my own AS. If I'm using 65,000, I have to define the AS number as 65,000. After that, network command is similar. Like you have to, if you want to advertise any network, we have to say network and network ID, and this mask option is optional. Now a mask option is optional, and more in detail about this I'll explain in my next video, where we'll see some practical examples. So I'll give you some more in detail about this configuration when I do the labs. So apart from that, there is a neighbor command. So neighbor command is mandatory here. Why? Because here on the router 1 you have to configure a neighbor command saying that neighbor whatever the IP address. Let's say the IP address of the router 2 is 1.1.1.2. Okay, and both the routers are in the same AS. Let's say AS number is 500. I have to say remote AS, and then I have to define the AS number as 500. So if this neighbor, and sorry, I think I'm using 65,000 here. So let's use the same number. So it is 65,000. So if I'm using 65,000 here, and if I use 65,000 here, automatically the router will understand that it's the internal BGP neighbors because my AS and the neighbor AS is same. If this number here and this number are different, then it will automatically understand as external BGP neighbors. So that's how based on the configurations what you are doing, the devices will understand automatically whether you are configuring the external BGP neighbor or internal BGP neighbor. Okay. So let us quickly revise what we discussed. So first we started with BGP neighbors. The main part of the BGP neighborship is neighborship has to be manually configured. That's the first thing we have seen initially. And we have two types of neighbors: internal BGP neighbors. Internal BGP neighbors, if both the routers are in the same AS, we call them as internal BGP neighbors. And external BGP neighbors, if one router is in one AS and the other router is in different AS, these two routers are referred as external BGP neighbors. And then we have seen some of the basic configuration of the routing protocol. Like we mainly use neighbor command inside your router BGP and whatever the AS number, and then we use some network commands to advertise. So it's more like your OSPF or EHRP except this neighbor command. And then BGP maintains three tables. It maintains a neighbor table, and we can verify the neighbor table by giving a show IP BGP summary command or show IP BGP neighbors command. BGP database table or BGP table, it has all the routes which are addressed inside the BGP, and finally we have routing table which contains the best route to the destination. Okay, so probably we'll see you in the next video where we'll try to get into some more labs.